The banker's letter arrived at dawn, and by the time the sun had fully risen over Ashworth Hall, Elira knew her family had 4 days left before the house, the fields, and everything her father had built would belong to someone else. She stood in the cold hallway with the paper shaking in her hand, reading the same line over and over. The debt owed to Duke Cassian Wolfe must be settled in full, or the estate will be seized. She had never met the Duke. She had only heard his name spoken in town with a mixture of respect and fear, the kind of name people used when they wanted to end an argument quickly. Her father, Edmund Ashworth, was resting in his study when she found him, his face pale and his hands trembling around a cup of tea gone cold. He did not look like the strong man who had once carried her on his shoulders through the orchard. He looked like a man who had already given up. "You knew about this," Elira said, her voice sharper than she intended. "You knew and you said nothing." "I did not want to frighten you," Edmund answered, not meeting her eyes. "I thought I could fix it before you ever had to know." "Fix it how? We have 4 days, father. 4 days before strangers walk through our home and call it theirs." Edmund set down his cup. His hand shook so badly that the china rattled against the saucer. "The Duke sent word this morning. He is coming here himself, this afternoon." Elira's stomach turned cold. A man like the Duke did not travel across the county to collect a debt in person unless he wanted something more than money. She had heard enough stories in the village to know how these things worked. A struggling family, a wealthy lord, and land that bordered his own like a puzzle piece waiting to be taken. She was certain in that moment exactly what kind of man was coming to their door. By noon, the house had been swept and the good curtains pulled back to let in the light, though nothing could hide the worn edges of the furniture or the faint cracks in the plaster. Elira dressed simply, refusing to pretend at a wealth they did not have. She would not perform for a man who had come to take everything from them. The carriage arrived exactly on time, black and polished, pulled by 2 horses so well groomed they looked like they belonged in a painting. Elira watched from the window as a tall man stepped down, dressed in a dark coat with no unnecessary decoration, no rings, no walking cane for show. He moved like someone who had never needed to prove his importance to anyone. She met him at the door before the housekeeper could, because she wanted to look him in the eye before he said a single word. "Duke Wolfe," she said, keeping her chin level, "I assume you are here to discuss my father's debt." "I am," he said. His voice was calm, low, careful, "and I would prefer to discuss it with him directly if that is agreeable." "It is not," Elira said. "Whatever you say to him, you may say in front of me. I am not a child to be shielded from bad news." Something flickered across his face, not annoyance but perhaps a kind of surprised respect. He nodded once. "Very well." They sat in the study, the 3 of them, with the afternoon light cutting long shadows across the floor. Edmund tried to speak first, to apologize, to explain the failed harvest and the illness that had drained their savings, but Cassian raised a hand gently. "I did not come to hear excuses, Mr. Ashworth. I came to offer a solution." Elira felt her pulse quicken. Here it was, the land grab dressed up in polite words. "I am prepared to forgive the debt entirely," Cassian continued, "on one condition." "Name it," Edmund said quickly, too quickly, the desperation plain in his voice. Cassian's eyes moved to Elira only for a moment, but she caught it. "I would like to discuss the matter privately with your daughter." "Absolutely not," Elira said before her father could answer. "If you have something to say, you may say it now in the open or not at all." Cassian studied her for a long moment. There was no anger in his expression, only something careful, almost weighed, as though he were deciding how much truth a person could hold at once. "As you wish," he said finally. "I will not take your land, Miss Ashworth. That was never my intention." "Then what is your intention?" Elira demanded. "Men like you do not forgive debts out of kindness. There is always a price." A faint, tired smile touched his mouth. "You are not wrong to be suspicious, but I promise you the price is not what you think." He rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out over the fields that had belonged to the Ashworth family for 3 generations. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, quieter, almost distant, as though he were speaking to someone who was not in the room at all. There is a matter between our families that goes back further than this debt, further than either of us. Illyra frowned. I do not understand. You will, Cashin said, but not today. Today, I only ask that you trust me enough to let the debt be settled, and to allow me to visit again, so that I may explain properly, when the time is right. Edmund, sensing an opening, leaned forward eagerly. Whatever arrangement satisfies you, your grace, we accept it. Father, Illyra warned. Illyra, we have no choice, Edmund said, his voice cracking. If the Duke is willing to release us from this debt, we cannot refuse out of pride. Illyra looked between the two men, the exhausted father who wanted only to protect what was left of his family, and the composed stranger who spoke in riddles about a past she knew nothing of. Every instinct told her something was being hidden from her, something larger than a simple business transaction. But with 4 days left before ruin, she had little room to argue. Fine, she said at last, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. The debt is settled, but I want to know the truth eventually, Duke Wolf. Whatever this is, whatever you are not telling us, I will not be kept in the dark forever. You have my word, Cashin said, and something in the steadiness of his voice made her almost believe him. He left before the sun set, his carriage disappearing down the long drive in a cloud of dust. Illyra stood on the front steps long after it was gone, arms crossed against the evening chill, turning his words over in her mind. There is a matter between our families that goes back further than this debt. What could a duke possibly have to do with a struggling farming family like her own? What history could exist between the Wolfs and the Ashworths that she had never once heard mentioned? That night she could not sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the way Cashin had looked at her, not with the greed she expected from a man circling a vulnerable family, but with something closer to caution, even guilt. It unsettled her more than open hostility would have. She could fight a man who wanted her land. She did not know how to fight a man who seemed to be carrying a secret meant for her alone. 2 days later, a letter arrived at Ashworth Hall, sealed with the wolf crest. Illyra opened it with unsteady hands, expecting terms, conditions, demands. Instead, she found a single, formal request. Duke Cashin Wolf requested her hand in marriage, with the promise that the debt would be fully and permanently erased, and that her father would retain the right to live at Ashworth Hall for the remainder of his life, regardless of what she decided. She read it 3 times before the meaning fully settled into her chest like a stone. It was exactly what she had feared from the beginning, and yet it was not. There was no mention of land transfer, no clause that gave him ownership of anything but her hand. He was not taking the estate through legal maneuvering. He wanted marriage, plainly and directly, though he had offered no explanation of feeling, no words of affection, nothing but the bare bones of an arrangement. She brought the letter to her father, who read it with tears gathering in his tired eyes. "He is offering you a way to save us both," Edmund said softly. "You do not have to accept Illyra. I would rather lose everything than force you into a marriage you do not want." "I know," Illyra said, though her heart was pounding. "But if I refuse, we lose the house within 2 days. That is not your burden to carry alone." "It is exactly my burden," she said, folding the letter carefully. "I am the one he asked for, not you." She walked to the window and looked out at the fields glowing gold in the late afternoon light. The same fields her mother had once tended with her own 2 hands before she passed away many years ago. Illyra thought of her mother often in moments like this, when a decision felt too heavy for one person to hold. She wished, not for the first time, that her mother were still alive to tell her what to do. Instead, she was alone with a letter from a stranger who claimed there was a secret buried somewhere between their 2 families, a secret important enough to trade for marriage rather than money. She did not know, as she stood there with the paper in her hand, that the answer to that secret was closer than she could have imagined, and that it would change everything she believed about her mother, about the Duke, and about herself. By the time she finally sat down to write her answer, her decision was already made. Whatever waited for her at Wolf Manor, Whatever truth Cashin was hiding behind his calm, careful words, she would face it. Not because she trusted him. Not yet. But because she refused to spend the rest of her life wondering what secret had been powerful enough to save her family and terrifying enough for a duke to hide it until the very last moment. She dipped her pen in ink and wrote a single line of acceptance, her hand steady despite the storm inside her chest. Whatever this marriage truly was, whatever it was built upon, she intended to uncover every hidden piece of it, no matter what it cost her. The following morning, she sent her answer to Wolf Manor, sealed with wax, carried by a servant on horseback. As she watched the rider disappear down the road, she felt the strange, unsettling sensation of a door closing behind her and another one, darker and more mysterious, slowly beginning to open ahead. The carriage that carried Alira away from Ashworth Hall rolled slowly down the long gravel drive, and she did not look back, though every part of her wanted to. She had said goodbye to her father at the door, his eyes wet with tears he tried to hide, and she had promised him she would write every week. Now, alone in the carriage with only her small trunk of belongings, she felt the full weight of what she had agreed to settle over her like a heavy blanket. Wolf Manor rose out of the hills long before the carriage reached its gates, gray stone walls and tall windows catching the afternoon light. It was larger than anything Alira had ever lived in, larger even than the church in her village, and as the carriage rolled through the iron gates, she felt smaller with every passing second. Cashin was waiting on the front steps when she arrived, dressed as plainly as he had been at Ashworth Hall, no crown of jewels or golden buttons, just a dark coat and an unreadable expression. He offered his hand to help her down from the carriage, and she took it only because refusing would have looked foolish in front of the watching servants. "You made good time," he said. "I had little reason to delay," Alira answered, pulling her hand back the moment her feet touched the ground. He led her inside, through a grand entrance hall lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. The air smelled of old wood and beeswax polish, and every sound she made, her footsteps, the rustle of her dress, echoed in a way that made her feel like an intruder rather than a new mistress of the house. "Mrs. Whitfield will show you to your rooms," Cashin said, gesturing toward a stout, gray-haired woman who appeared from a side hallway with a ring of keys at her waist. "She has managed this household for many years. If you need anything, she will see to it." Mrs. Whitfield offered a polite but measured smile, the kind given to someone whose place in the household had not yet been decided. "This way, Miss Ashworth, or perhaps I should say, Your Grace, now that the ceremony has been arranged." "The ceremony is not for another week," Alira said quickly. "Of course," Mrs. Whitfield said, though her expression suggested she had already made up her mind about the outcome. The rooms given to Alira were beautiful in a way that felt almost cold, tall windows overlooking a garden gone slightly wild, a large bed with curtains the color of dark wine, and a writing desk positioned near the window where the light was best. It was the kind of room built for a woman who was meant to be comfortable, but not necessarily happy. That evening, dinner was a quiet, formal affair. Cashin sat at the head of a table long enough to seat 20 guests, though only the two of them were present, their voices small in the vast dining hall. He asked polite questions about her journey, about her father's health, and she answered with equally polite, guarded responses. Neither of them mentioned the letter that had brought her here, nor the secret he had promised to reveal. "You said there was something you needed to explain," Alira finally said, setting down her fork. "About a matter between our families." Cashin's jaw tightened slightly. "I did say that." "Then explain it." "Not yet," he said, and though his voice remained calm, there was something underneath it, a kind of restraint that suggested the words cost him effort to hold back. "There are things that must be handled carefully, Alira. I ask for your patience." "You ask for a great deal, considering you have told me nothing." "I know," he said quietly, "and I am sorry for that, but some truths, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. I want to be certain of the timing before I share this one with you." Alira studied him across the long table, searching his face for any hint of deception, but found only tired sincerity, the look of a man carrying something heavier than she understood. It frustrated her more than open dishonesty would have. She could fight a liar. She did not know how to fight a man who seemed to be protecting her from something. The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. Alira explored the manor slowly, learning its long corridors and hidden staircases, while Cashin spent much of his time occupied with estate business, meeting with tenants, reviewing accounts, riding out to inspect the fields that stretched for miles beyond the manor walls. They took most meals together, and though their conversations remained cautious, Alira began to notice things about him that did not match the image she had built in her mind. He was patient with the servants in a way she had not expected from a man of his position, remembering the names of stable boys and kitchen maids, asking after a groundskeeper's ailing wife with what seemed like genuine concern. He read late into the night, his study light often still burning when she passed by on her way to bed. And though he remained guarded with her, there were moments, brief and unguarded, when she caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something between sadness and longing. One afternoon, while wandering the eastern wing of the manor in search of the library, Alira found herself in an unfamiliar corridor lined with closed doors. Most stood slightly ajar, revealing sitting rooms and guest quarters covered in white cloth, unused for years. But one door at the very end of the hallway was different. It was locked, its brass handle polished as though someone cleaned it regularly, unlike the dusty handles of the doors around it. She pressed her ear to the wood out of pure curiosity, though she heard nothing but silence. She tried the handle gently, already knowing it would not turn, and she was right. Locked, firmly, deliberately. That room is not to be entered. Alira spun around to find Mrs. Whitfield standing a few feet behind her, her expression unreadable, her hands folded in front of her apron. "I was only exploring," Alira said, feeling oddly guilty despite having done nothing wrong. "Of course," Mrs. Whitfield said, "but His Grace prefers that room remain private. It belonged to his late father. What is kept inside it?" Mrs. Whitfield's expression flickered, something passing behind her eyes too quickly for Alira to read clearly. "That is not for me to say, Miss Ashworth. If you wish to know, you must ask His Grace himself." She turned and walked away before Alira could ask another question, leaving her standing alone in the quiet corridor, staring at the locked door with a growing sense that whatever secret Cashin was hiding lived somewhere inside that very room. That night at dinner, Alira could not help herself. "I found a locked room in the eastern wing today. Mrs. Whitfield said it belonged to your father." Cashin's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, deliberately, as though buying himself time to choose his words. "It did." "Why is it locked?" "Because there are things inside it that are not ready to be seen." "Not ready for whom? For me." He looked at her then directly, and for the first time since her arrival she saw something raw in his expression, something that looked almost like fear. "Yes," he said quietly, "for you." Alira's heart pounded. "Why me?" "Because what is inside that room concerns your family as much as mine," he said, "and I need to be certain you are ready to hear it before I show you." "I am ready now," she said firmly. "I have been ready since the moment you first mentioned a secret between our families. Every day you delay only makes me trust you less, Cashin. If you truly want this marriage to mean something beyond a business arrangement, you cannot keep hiding behind locked doors." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the candle flickering between them. "You are right," he finally admitted. "But I ask for a little more time, not because I wish to deceive you, but because once you know the truth, everything between us will change, and I want to be certain we are both prepared for what comes after." Alira wanted to press further, to demand he open that door immediately and show her whatever secret lived inside it, but something in his voice, the exhaustion, the quiet dread, stopped her. Whatever was behind that door was not a small thing. It was something that had shaped his entire life, and perhaps hers as well, without her ever knowing it existed. The wedding took place a week later in a small chapel near the manor, attended only by her father, a handful of Cashin's distant relatives, and the household staff. Elira wore a simple gown, and Cashin stood beside her looking as composed as always, though she noticed his hands were not entirely steady when he took hers to exchange vows. The ceremony was brief, formal, and strangely hollow, two people bound together by circumstance rather than affection, watched by witnesses who seemed to sense the same emptiness Elira felt in her own chest. Afterward, at the small gathering held in the manor's drawing room, her father pulled her aside, his eyes searching hers with quiet concern. "Are you happy, Elira?" She hesitated before answering. "I do not know yet, father, but I believe I am safe, and for now that will have to be enough." Edmund nodded slowly, though worry still lingered in his expression. "If he ever mistreats you, if this arrangement ever becomes something you cannot bear, you send word to me immediately. Duke or not, I will come for you." "I know," Elira said, squeezing his hand. "But I do not think that will be necessary. Whatever Cashin is hiding, I do not believe it comes from cruelty. I believe it comes from something closer to grief." Her father studied her carefully, as though trying to determine whether her words were an assurance for him or for herself. "Grief over what?" "I do not know," Elira admitted. "Not yet, but I intend to find out." That night, after the guests had gone and the manor had fallen quiet, Elira stood once again outside the locked door in the eastern wing, her candle casting flickering shadows across the polished handle. She did not try to open it. She only stood there, staring at the wood as though she could see through it by sheer force of will, wondering what truth waited on the other side, and how much longer she would have to wait before Cashin finally trusted her enough to reveal it. Behind her unseen, Cashin stood at the end of the corridor, watching her from the shadows with an expression of quiet sorrow, his hand resting against the wall as though steadying himself against a weight only he could feel. He did not approach her, not yet, but as he watched his new wife standing before the room that held his father's final secret, he knew the truth could not remain hidden much longer, and he was not certain he was ready for what would happen once it finally came into the light. Weeks passed at Wolf Manor, and Elira settled into a life that felt neither entirely foreign nor entirely her own. She learned the rhythm of the household, the hours when the kitchen filled with the smell of fresh bread, the paths through the garden where the roses still bloomed despite years of neglect, the sound of Cashin's footsteps in the hallway late at night when sleep would not come to him. She had not forgotten the locked door in the eastern wing, nor the promise he had made to eventually explain its secret, but she had grown patient enough to wait, watching him carefully, gathering pieces of a puzzle she could not yet see whole. It was Clara Bennett, a young woman from the village who had been hired to assist with correspondence and household accounts, who first mentioned Elira's mother in a way that made her blood run cold. They were sitting together in the small parlor one afternoon, sorting through invitations for a dinner Cashin had reluctantly agreed to host, when Clara paused over a stack of old letters tucked into a drawer of the writing desk. "These are addressed to a name I do not recognize," Clara said, frowning at the faded ink. "Elinor, do you know who that might be?" Elira's hands went still. "Elinor was my mother's name." Clara looked up, surprised. "Your mother, but these letters are old, Elira, decades old by the look of the paper, and they are signed by someone named Gerald." "Gerald Wolfe," Elira said slowly, the name settling into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. "Cashin's father." The two women stared at each other, the implications hanging heavy in the quiet room. Elira reached for the stack of letters with trembling hands, but before she could open even one, the parlor door opened and Cashin stepped inside, his expression shifting the moment he saw what rested in her hands. "Where did you find those?" he asked, his voice tight. "In the desk drawer," Clara said quickly, sensing the sudden tension. "I did not know they were private, Your Grace, I only—" "It is not your fault, Clara," Cashin said, though his eyes never left Elira's face. "You may leave us." Clara hurried from the room, closing the door softly behind her, leaving Elira and Cashin alone, with the letters resting between them like a live coal neither of them wanted to touch. These are addressed to my mother, Elira said, her voice barely above a whisper. Written by your father. Cassian did not answer immediately. He crossed the room slowly and sat down across from her, his hands folded tightly together, his knuckles pale. Yes, he finally said. Why does your father have letters written to my mother? What is this, Cassian? It is exactly what you fear it might be, he said quietly, and exactly what I have been trying to find the right moment to explain. Elira's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Then explain it now. No more delays, no more locked doors. Cassian took a slow breath, as though gathering courage for something he had rehearsed many times in his mind, but never spoken aloud. My father and your mother knew each other long before either of them married. Before you or I were born. Knew each other how? They were in love, Cassian said simply, the words landing between them with the weight of a confession finally released after years of silence. Deeply, truly in love, before circumstances and family expectations and the demands of two very different stations in life tore them apart. Elira felt the room tilt slightly around her. That is not possible. My mother married my father. She loved him, Cassian. I remember the way she looked at him, the way she spoke of him even in her final days. I do not doubt that she came to love your father deeply, Cassian said gently. But before that, there was someone else. My father spoke of her only once, near the end of his life, when illness had stripped away whatever pride had kept him silent for so many years. He told me about a woman named Elina, a woman he had loved with his whole heart, a woman he was forbidden to marry because his family demanded he wed someone of noble birth, someone who could strengthen the Wolf estate rather than a farmer's daughter with nothing to offer but her heart. Elira's eyes filled with tears she did not fully understand, grief for a mother she thought she had known completely, now revealed to have carried a private sorrow Elira had never once suspected. Why did they separate? She asked, her voice cracking. My grandfather forbade the match, Cassian said. He threatened to disown my father entirely, to strip him of any inheritance, any title, any future if he married beneath his station. My father was young and afraid, and in the end, he chose duty over love. He married my mother, a woman chosen for her family's connections rather than any affection between them. Your mother, heartbroken, eventually married your father and built a life of her own. And your father simply let her go, without a fight. He regretted it every day of his life, Cassian said quietly. He told me so in that final conversation before he passed. He said it was the single greatest failure of his existence, choosing wealth and status over the woman he truly loved. And before he died, he made me promise something. Elira's breath caught. What promise? Cassian reached into his coat and withdrew a folded letter, worn soft from years of handling, and passed it carefully into her hands. Read it yourself. Elira unfolded the paper with shaking fingers. The handwriting was elegant but weakened, clearly written by a man near the end of his life. My son, if you are reading this, then I have finally found the courage to tell you the truth I hid for too many years. There was a woman named Elina whom I loved more deeply than I ever loved anyone else in my life. I let her go out of fear, out of weakness, out of a misplaced loyalty to a family name that never once loved me back the way she did. I do not ask you to right my wrongs, for that is not possible now. But if the day ever comes when Elina's family needs help, whatever help you are able to give, I ask that you give it freely, without hesitation, without condition. This is the only way I know to make peace with the greatest regret of my life. Protect them, Cassian, as I should have protected her. This is my final wish, and I trust you to honor it. Elira lowered the letter slowly, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. This is why you forgave the debt, she whispered. This is why you offered marriage instead of simply erasing what we owed. Yes, Cassian said softly. When I learned of your father's debt, and I discovered the family name attached to it, I could not believe the timing. It felt as though my father's final wish had arrived at my door, asking to be fulfilled at last. So this marriage, Elira said slowly, each word feeling heavier than the last, was never about me at all. It was about honoring your father's promise. That is how it began, Cashin admitted. I will not lie to you about that. When I first proposed, I did so out of obligation, a debt of honor I felt bound to repay, not because I knew you, or loved you, or wanted anything beyond fulfilling my father's dying wish. Alira stood abruptly, the letter slipping from her fingers to the floor. So I am nothing more than an obligation to you, a debt repaid through marriage, just as I feared from the very beginning. That is not what I said, Cashin said, rising as well, his voice urgent now. That is how it began, Alira, not how it remains. How am I meant to believe that? She demanded, her voice breaking. You married me because of a promise made by a dying man decades before I was born, not because of anything I am, or anything I have done, or anything I might ever become to you. I am simply the closing of a debt your father left unpaid. Alira, please. No, she said, backing away from him, her hands trembling at her sides. I need time, I need to think. Please, just give me time. She fled the room before he could say another word, her footsteps echoing down the long corridor, past the portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch her flight with cold, painted eyes, past the locked door that no longer held any mystery now that its secret had finally spilled into the light. She did not stop until she reached her own chambers, where she collapsed against the closed door, sliding down until she sat crumpled on the floor, the truth of everything settling over her like a weight she did not know how to carry. Her mother had loved another man before her father, a man whose son had married her not out of choice, but out of inherited guilt. Everything she had believed about her family's history, about her mother's quiet contentment, about the very reason she now lived within these walls, had shifted beneath her feet like sand pulled away by a retreating tide. Outside her door, she heard Cashin's footsteps approach, then pause, then finally retreat back down the corridor, leaving her alone with her grief and her anger and the unbearable question that now consumed every thought in her mind. If their marriage had begun as nothing more than the fulfillment of a dead man's promise, what, if anything, could it ever become beyond that? And did Cashin himself even know the answer, or was he as lost within this tangled inheritance of love and regret as she was? She did not sleep that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying her mother's face in old memories, searching for some hint of the sorrow Cashin claimed she had carried, some shadow of a love lost long before Alira had ever been born. She found nothing but warmth and kindness and the quiet devotion her mother had always shown her father. Perhaps Alina had truly moved past her heartbreak. Or perhaps, Alira thought with a fresh wave of grief, some sorrows were simply too well hidden to ever be seen by the people who loved you most. Alira avoided Cashin for 3 days after the truth came to light. She took her meals in her room, claiming illness, though Mrs. Whitfield's knowing glances told her the housekeeper suspected the real cause of her absence. She spent her hours pacing the length of her chambers, staring out the window at the garden below, and rereading Gerald Wolfe's final letter until the words had carved themselves permanently into her memory. Protect them, Cashin, as I should have protected her. She understood now why Cashin had hesitated so long to reveal the truth. It was not a small thing to tell a woman that her marriage had been born from a dead man's guilt rather than any genuine desire. And yet, understanding his hesitation did not soften the ache in her chest, the feeling that she had been chosen not for herself, but as a vessel for someone else's unfinished business. On the 4th day, a letter arrived from her father, and reading his familiar handwriting brought a fresh wave of longing for the simplicity of her old life. Before dukes and dead men's promises had complicated everything, she thought she understood about her own family. My dearest Alira, the letter began, I hope this finds you settling well into your new home. I think of you every day and pray that Duke Wolfe treats you with the kindness and respect you deserve. There is something I have been meaning to tell you, something I perhaps should have shared long ago, but never found the right moment. Your mother, in her final years, often spoke in her sleep of a name I did not recognize. Gerald. I never asked her about it, out of respect for whatever private memories she carried, but I confess it troubled me quietly for years. If you ever learn anything of this name during your time at Wolfe Manor, I would be grateful to know it. though I understand if such things are not mine to ask after now that she is gone." Elira read the letter twice, her hands trembling. Even her father, it seemed, had sensed the shadow of a love her mother carried but never spoke of openly. It was not the confirmation Elira wanted, not exactly, but it was enough to convince her that Cashin had told her the truth, at least as far as he understood it. She folded the letter carefully and sat with it in her lap for a long while, thinking of her mother in a new light. A young woman once deeply in love with a man she was forbidden to marry, who had gone on to build an entirely different life, and who had apparently carried the memory of that first love quietly within her until her very last days. It changed nothing about the love Elira had witnessed between her parents, but it added a layer of complexity to her mother's history that made Elira ache with a strange, retroactive sympathy. She found Cashin late that evening in his study, bent over a stack of papers by candlelight. Though his eyes were fixed on nothing in particular, his mind clearly elsewhere. He looked up when she entered, surprise and cautious hope flickering across his face. "Elira," he said, setting down his pen, "I did not expect you." "I received a letter from my father today," she said, standing in the doorway, unwilling yet to fully enter the room. "He mentioned that my mother used to speak your father's name in her sleep in her final years. He did not know what it meant. I do now." Cashin's expression softened into something like sorrow. "I am sorry, Elira, for all of it, for the secrecy and for the pain this truth has caused you. That was never my intention." "I know," she said, and found to her own surprise that she meant it. "I have had time to think these past few days. I am still angry, Cashin. I still feel as though I was brought into this marriage under false pretenses, but I no longer believe you meant to deceive me out of cruelty. I believe you were carrying a burden you did not fully know how to set down." "That is exactly it," Cashin said, rising from his desk and crossing the room toward her, though he stopped a respectful distance away, as though unwilling to press further than she was ready for. "My entire life, I watched my father carry regret like a stone tied around his neck. He was never fully present, even in moments that should have brought him joy. I used to resent him for it before I understood why. When he finally told me the truth, near the end, I realized his sorrow had shaped not only his life, but mine as well, in ways I did not fully recognize until I stood in your father's study with that debt notice in my hand." "Why did you not simply forgive the debt and walk away?" Elira asked. "Why marriage? Why bind yourself and me to something so permanent when a simple act of generosity would have honored your father's wish just as well?" Cashin was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tightening as though the answer cost him something to admit. "Because forgiving the debt alone felt insufficient," he finally said. "My father's regret was not simply about money or land or circumstance. It was about a love he lost because he was too afraid to fight for it. I told myself that marrying you was the only way to truly honor what he asked of me, to ensure your family's security in a way that could never be undone or revoked. But if I am honest with myself, Elira, and with you, there was something else as well." "What else?" "Curiosity," he admitted, a faint, almost embarrassed smile touching his mouth. "I wanted to know the woman whose mother had captured my father's heart so completely that he carried her memory for the rest of his life. I wondered what kind of family could inspire that sort of devotion. And when I met you, standing in your father's hallway, refusing to let me speak to him without you present, chin raised, eyes sharp with suspicion, I understood immediately why my father might have loved a woman from your family so deeply. You carry the same fire your mother must have carried." Elira felt heat rise in her cheeks despite herself, though she was careful not to let it soften her guard completely. "That does not change the fact that our marriage began as an obligation." "No," Cashin agreed. "It does not, but I would like the chance to prove that it does not have to remain only that. I cannot undo how this began, Elira. I can only ask for the opportunity to build something honest from here forward if you are willing to give it." Elira studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but found only quiet earnestness, the same steady patience she had noticed in him since the very first day he had walked into her father's study. She thought of her mother, young and heartbroken, choosing to build a new life rather than remain trapped in grief over what could not be. Perhaps there was wisdom in that same choice now, though the circumstances were different. "I am not ready to trust you completely," she said finally. "But I am willing to try Cashin, slowly, on my own terms." "That is more than I hoped for," he said, and the relief in his voice was unmistakable. Over the following weeks, something shifted quietly between them. Alira began joining Cashin on his morning rides across the estate, learning the names of tenants and the history of the land that would, in some distant future, belong to any children they might have. She found herself laughing, genuinely, at small moments. An unexpected joke from Cashin, the sight of a clumsy new foal stumbling through the stable yard, the warmth of shared silence over breakfast that no longer felt strained. Cashin, in turn, began opening the locked door in the eastern wing, no longer as a forbidden secret but as a shared space, where he showed Alira his father's old belongings, a worn journal filled with private thoughts, a small portrait of a young woman Alira immediately recognized as her own mother, painted decades before Alira was even born. "He kept this hidden his entire life," Cashin said quietly, as they stood together studying the portrait. "I do not think he ever stopped loving her, even after all those years, even after marrying my mother and building an entirely separate life." Alira touched the edge of the frame gently, tracing the painted outline of her mother's youthful face. "She looks happy here." "She was, I believe, for a time," Cashin said, "before everything changed." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people slowly learning to trust each other despite the complicated history that had brought them together. Alira found herself, for the first time since arriving at Wolf Manor, feeling something other than suspicion or obligation when she looked at Cashin. It was not love, not yet, but it was the quiet beginning of something that might, given enough time and honesty, eventually grow into it. Yet even as their fragile trust began to take root, neither of them knew that their peace would not last long. Far from the quiet halls of Wolf Manor, in a smaller estate several counties away, a man named Julian Wolf, a distant cousin with ambitions far greater than his modest inheritance, had already begun making inquiries into the sudden, unexpected marriage of the Duke of Wolf Manor to a farmer's daughter with no title, no fortune, and as far as Julian was concerned, no right to claim any portion of the Wolf legacy that he believed should rightfully belong to him. Julian Wolf arrived at Wolf Manor unannounced on a gray afternoon, 3 weeks after Alira had first begun to feel something like peace within its walls. She was in the garden when his carriage rolled through the gates, cutting fresh flowers for the dining table, and she watched with growing unease as a lean, sharply dressed man stepped down and surveyed the grounds with an expression that reminded her uncomfortably of a hawk assessing its next meal. "Who is that?" she asked Mrs. Whitfield, who had come out to help carry the cut flowers inside. Mrs. Whitfield's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Julian Wolf, His Grace's cousin. I did not know he was expected." "Neither did I," Alira said, setting down her basket and smoothing her skirts before walking toward the front of the house. Cashin met his cousin at the door, and though his greeting was polite, Alira could sense the tension in his shoulders, the careful distance he maintained even as he extended a hand in welcome. "Julian," Cashin said, "this is unexpected." "Is it?" Julian replied, his smile thin and calculated. "I heard the most fascinating news, cousin, that you had married, quietly, quickly, to a woman with no title, no fortune, and forgive me for saying so, no obvious connection to our family at all. I confess I could not resist coming to see for myself." His eyes shifted to Alira as she approached, and she felt the weight of his assessment, cold and calculating, as though he were tallying her worth on some invisible ledger and finding the sum lacking. "This is my wife, Alira," Cashin said, his voice carrying a firm note of warning that Alira had not heard from him before. "Alira, my cousin Julian." "A pleasure," Alira said, extending her hand, though Julian's grip lingered a moment too long, his eyes lingering on her with an expression that made her skin crawl. "The pleasure is entirely mine," Julian said. I must say, Alira, you have caused quite a stir in certain circles. A duke marrying so far beneath his station. People are talking. People often talk about things that are none of their concern, Cashin said sharply, stepping slightly between them. What brings you here, Julian? I doubt it was simple curiosity. Julian's smile did not waver, though something colder flickered behind his eyes. Family concern, cousin. Nothing more, though I confess I am also here on a matter of business. Perhaps we could discuss it privately. Cashin hesitated only a moment before nodding toward his study. Very well, Alira, if you would excuse us. Alira watched them disappear down the hallway, an uneasy feeling settling deep in her stomach. She did not trust Julian Woolf, not for a single moment, and she found herself lingering near the study door after Mrs. Whitfield had gone, unable to fully walk away. She could not make out every word through the heavy wooden door, but fragments reached her, enough to understand the shape of the conversation taking place inside. The family council will not simply accept a marriage of this nature without question. My marriage is not subject to your approval, Julian. There are ways to have such unions dissolved, cousin, particularly when questions arise about the circumstances surrounding it. You would do well to remember your place. And you would do well to remember that without an heir of your own, the Woolf title and everything attached to it may eventually pass to someone with far less patience for scandal than I possess. Alira's blood ran cold. She stepped back from the door, her heart pounding, and hurried away before either man could discover she had been listening. She retreated to her chambers, her mind racing through the implications of what she had overheard. Julian intended to challenge the marriage somehow, to find some flaw or scandal that could unravel everything Cashin had built. And if he succeeded, it would not only threaten her position as Cashin's wife, but potentially her father's security as well, since the debt forgiveness had been so closely tied to the marriage itself. That evening, Cashin found her in the small library, staring blankly at a book she had not actually been reading. "You look troubled," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I overheard part of your conversation with Julian," she admitted, seeing no purpose in pretending otherwise. "He intends to challenge our marriage." Cashin's expression darkened. "I was hoping to spare you that particular worry." "I would rather know the truth than be protected from it," Alira said firmly. "Especially now. Tell me everything, Cashin. What exactly is Julian planning?" Cashin sighed and rubbed a hand over his tired eyes. "Julian has long resented that the title and estate passed to me rather than to his branch of the family, despite the fact that my father was the elder brother, and the succession was entirely proper. He has spent years searching for any opportunity to weaken my claim, any scandal or irregularity he might exploit. Our sudden marriage, to a woman outside noble circles, gives him exactly the kind of ammunition he has been waiting for." "What can he actually do?" Alira asked. "Surely a marriage cannot simply be dissolved because someone disapproves of it." "Not easily, no," Cashin said. "But if he can prove the marriage was arranged under false pretenses, or through coercion, or if he can convince the family council and certain influential members of society that the union was improperly conducted, he could create enough scandal to pressure a dissolution, or at the very least, damage my standing enough to weaken my position within the family and among our peers. And if he succeeds, then everything I promised your father would be at risk," Cashin said grimly. "The debt forgiveness, your family's security, all of it was tied to our marriage. If the marriage is dissolved, Julian could argue that the original terms of the debt forgiveness should be reconsidered as well." Alira felt a fresh wave of anger rise within her, not at Cashin this time, but at the injustice of a system that would allow a man like Julian to threaten an entire family's future simply because he coveted a title that was never rightfully his. "Then we cannot let him succeed." "No," Cashin agreed. "We cannot, but I do not yet know exactly what approach he intends to take or what evidence, if any, he believes he possesses." Over the following days, an uneasy tension settled over Woolf Manor. Julian did not leave immediately, instead extending his visit under the pretense of family obligation, using the time to quietly interview servants, examine estate records, and ask pointed questions that made everyone in the household increasingly uncomfortable. Alira caught him more than once emerging from rooms he had no reason to enter, his expression carefully neutral, though she was certain he was searching for something specific. It was Clara who finally brought the danger into sharp focus. She approached Alira one evening, her face pale with worry, clutching a folded piece of paper in her trembling hands. "I found this," Clara whispered, glancing anxiously toward the hallway before stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind her. "In the study, while gathering papers for his grace. Julian must have left it behind by accident." Alira took the paper and unfolded it slowly. It was a letter, unfinished, addressed to someone identified only as "my associate in London," detailing Julian's intention to gather testimony suggesting that Cashin had used undue influence, financial pressure disguised as generosity, to coerce a vulnerable young woman into marriage against her true wishes, thereby rendering the union legally questionable and morally scandalous enough to warrant investigation by the family council. "He is going to twist everything," Alira said, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. "He is going to make it look as though Cashin forced me into this marriage." "Can he actually succeed with such a claim?" Clara asked. "I do not know," Alira admitted. "But even if he cannot legally dissolve the marriage, the scandal alone could damage Cashin's reputation, and mine, beyond repair. And if enough doubt is cast on the legitimacy of our marriage, it could unravel everything, including the protection promised to my father." She sat down heavily, staring at the letter in her hands, feeling the full weight of Julian's scheme settling over her. Whatever fragile trust and growing connection she had begun to build with Cashin over the past weeks now felt suddenly fragile against the very real threat of a man determined to destroy it for his own ambition. She thought of her mother and of Gerald Wolfe, two people who had allowed fear and family pressure to separate them decades ago, and she felt a fierce, sudden resolve rise within her chest. She would not allow history to repeat itself in quite the same way. Whatever complicated, uncertain feelings she still carried about the true nature of her marriage, she refused to let a man like Julian Wolfe manipulate the situation for his own selfish gain, especially not at the cost of her father's security or Cashin's hard-won integrity. She found Cashin later that night in his study, and without a word placed Julian's unfinished letter on the desk before him. He read it in silence, his expression darkening with each line, his hands tightening into fists by the time he finished. "He means to destroy everything," Cashin said quietly, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Then we stop him," Alira said firmly, "together." Cashin looked up at her, surprise flickering across his face at the certainty in her voice. "You would help me fight this, even now, even after everything I have not yet fully earned from you. This is no longer only about you, or about the truth of how our marriage began," Alira said. "This is about protecting my father, and about refusing to let a man like Julian rewrite our story into something ugly for his own benefit. Whatever else remains uncertain between us, Cashin on this matter, we are aligned completely." A slow, grateful smile spread across Cashin's face, the first genuine smile Alira had seen from him since Julian's arrival. "Then let us make certain he does not succeed." They spent the rest of the night poring over estate records, correspondence, and legal documents, searching for anything that might strengthen their position against whatever scheme Julian intended to bring before the family council. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of Wolfe Manor, as though the house itself sensed the coming storm that Julian's ambition was about to unleash upon it. The family council meeting was scheduled for the following fortnight, held at the ancestral seat of the Wolfe family, a sprawling estate 2 days' journey from Wolfe Manor, where generations of family disputes had been settled by a rotating panel of senior relatives and appointed legal advisors. Julian had wasted no time formally submitting his complaint, alleging that Cashin's marriage had been conducted under circumstances that raised serious questions about consent, propriety, and the true motivations behind the union. Alira read the formal complaint with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Julian had woven together half-truths and careful omissions into a narrative that painted Cashin as a manipulative opportunist, who had exploited a desperate family's financial ruin to secure a hasty, questionable marriage, while conveniently ignoring the genuine care that had grown between them since. "He makes it sound as though you threatened my father," Alira said, pacing the length of Cashin's study as she reread the document for the third time. "As though I had no choice in the matter at all." "That is precisely his intention," Cashin said grimly. "If the council believes there was coercion, they have grounds to investigate further, and even if they ultimately find nothing improper, the scandal alone could be enough to damage us both irreparably." "Then we must prove otherwise," Alira said. "We need testimony, evidence, something that shows the truth of what actually happened, not Julian's twisted version of events." They spent the following days gathering everything they could. Edmund traveled from Ashworth Hall to provide testimony regarding the true nature of the debt forgiveness and marriage proposal, confirming that Alira had been given every opportunity to refuse and had chosen the arrangement of her own free will. Mrs. Whitfield offered her own account of the household's observations, describing the growing warmth between Alira and Cashin that any objective witness could see was far removed from the cold, transactional arrangement Julian described. Clara, though nervous about testifying against a man of Julian's standing, agreed to share what she had witnessed and the letter she had discovered detailing his scheme. Still, Alira could not shake the feeling that something more was needed, some piece of undeniable truth that would silence Julian's accusations entirely. It was while searching through the papers in the locked eastern room, now fully open and accessible, that she found it. Tucked among Gerald Wolfe's old journals was a final entry, written in the same weakened hand as the letter Cashin had already shown her, but containing additional details she had not yet seen. Gerald had written extensively about his regret, about Alina, about the promise he extracted from his son, but he had also written something else entirely, a private reflection dated only months before his death, expressing his hope that whatever arrangement eventually came to pass between the Ashworth and Wolfe families would be built not merely on obligation, but on genuine affection, should fate allow it. "I do not wish for Cashin to marry out of guilt alone," Gerald had written. "If circumstances ever bring our families together again, I pray it becomes something real, something neither of us was brave enough to claim for ourselves. Let my son succeed where I failed." Alira brought the journal entry to Cashin immediately, her hands trembling with the weight of what she had found. "This proves your father's intentions were never about coercion or manipulation. He hoped for something genuine to grow between our families. This is exactly what we need to counter Julian's claims." Cashin read the passage twice, his eyes glistening with unexpected emotion. "I did not know he had written this. I only ever saw the letter addressed directly to me." "Then we will present it to the council," Alira said firmly, "along with everything else we have gathered. We will show them the truth, Cashin, not Julian's version of it." The journey to the ancestral estate passed in tense silence, both of them rehearsing arguments and reviewing evidence, aware that the outcome of the council meeting would determine far more than simply the fate of their marriage. When they arrived, Julian was already present, standing confidently among a cluster of relatives and legal advisors, his expression smug with the certainty of a man who believed victory was already assured. The council chamber was a long, formal room dominated by a heavy wooden table, where a dozen senior family members and legal representatives had gathered to hear the matter. Alira felt every eye turned toward her as she entered beside Cashin, and she forced herself to stand tall, refusing to let Julian's confident smirk shake her resolve. Julian presented his case first, painting a careful, damaging portrait of desperation and manipulation, citing the timing of the debt notice, the swift proposal, the lack of any prior relationship between Alira and Cashin before their sudden engagement. He spoke with practiced eloquence, his words designed to plant doubt in the minds of the council members regardless of the actual truth. When it came time for Cashin to respond, he did not simply refute Julian's claims point by point, as Alira had expected. Instead, he told the truth, plainly and completely, beginning with his father's dying confession, the promise extracted regarding Alina's family, and the complicated, evolving nature of a marriage that had indeed begun as an obligation, but had since grown into something Cashin described with quiet, unmistakable sincerity as genuine care and respect for the woman standing beside him. He read Gerald's final journal entry aloud to the assembled council, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath it. When he finished, the room was silent, several council members exchanging glances that suggested the tide of the conversation had shifted considerably. Then Edmund spoke, his voice trembling with age but firm with conviction, describing the genuine choice his daughter had been given, the respect Cashin had shown throughout the entire process, and the transformation he had witnessed in his daughter's letters over the past weeks, from cautious uncertainty to something that increasingly resembled contentment and trust. Mrs. Whitfield and Clara offered their own testimonies, painting a picture of a household where genuine warmth had grown between the Duke and his new wife, far removed from Julian's portrait of manipulation and coercion. Finally, Alira herself was asked to speak. She stood before the council, her heart pounding, and chose her words carefully. "I will not pretend our marriage began under simple or entirely romantic circumstances," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her nerves. "It began because my family faced ruin, and because Duke Wolf felt bound by a promise made by his dying father. I will not deny that truth, because denying it would be its own form of dishonesty, but what has grown since then has been real. I have come to know this man's character, his patience, his integrity, and yes, his genuine care for my well-being, not because he was obligated to show it, but because it is simply who he is. Julian Wolf did not travel here out of concern for my welfare, or for the sanctity of marriage, or for any principle beyond his own ambition for a title that was never rightfully his to claim. I ask this council to see the situation clearly, not through the distorted lens my husband's cousin has constructed for his own benefit." A murmur passed through the assembled council members, and Alira could see, in the shifting expressions around the table, that her words, combined with the evidence and testimonies presented, had begun to dismantle the foundation of Julian's carefully constructed scandal. Julian, sensing the tide turning against him, attempted one final desperate maneuver, producing a servant he claimed had witnessed Alira expressing reluctance about the marriage in its early days, hoping to salvage some shred of his original argument. But under careful questioning from the council's legal advisor, the servant's testimony quickly fell apart, revealing that Julian had approached him privately beforehand, offering payment in exchange for testimony that supported his claims, a revelation that turned the council's suspicion firmly and permanently against Julian himself. The chief advisor of the council, an elderly man with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, finally rose to deliver the council's assessment. "Having heard all testimony and reviewed all evidence presented," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, "this council finds no basis for the claims brought forth by Julian Wolf. Furthermore, this council finds troubling evidence that Julian Wolf attempted to manufacture false testimony in support of his complaint, a matter which shall be addressed separately and with appropriate seriousness." Julian's face drained of color as the weight of his failed scheme settled fully upon him, the confident smirk he had worn throughout the proceedings finally vanishing entirely. This council recognizes the marriage between Duke Cashin Wolf and Alira Ashworth as entirely legitimate, entered into freely and without improper coercion, and finds Duke Wolf's conduct throughout this matter to be beyond reproach, the advisor continued. Julian Wolf's complaint is hereby dismissed in its entirety, and given the evidence of attempted manipulation of witness testimony, this council further recommends a formal review of Julian Wolf's standing within the family, and any future claims he might bring before this body. Relief flooded through Alira so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled beneath her. Beside her, she felt Cassion's hand find hers, gripping it firmly, gratefully, and she did not pull away. Julian left the chamber without a word, his humiliation complete, his ambitions for the Wolf title thoroughly and publicly extinguished. As he passed Alira on his way out, he offered her one final, venomous glance, but she met it without flinching, feeling, for the first time since his arrival at Wolf Manor, that she had absolutely nothing left to fear from him. Outside the council chamber in the quiet hallway beyond, Cassion turned to Alira, his expression open and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen from him. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for standing beside me in there, for speaking the truth, even the difficult parts of it." "I meant every word," Alira said softly, "all of it." Cassion studied her for a long moment, something warm and hopeful flickering in his eyes. "Even the part about my character, about genuine care." Alira felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not look away. "Especially that part." For the first time since their wedding day, Cassion reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch tender and uncertain, as though he were still learning the boundaries of what was welcome between them. Alira did not pull away. Instead, she found herself leaning slightly into the warmth of his hand, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had shifted between them over the past difficult weeks. They had won. Julian's scheme had been thoroughly defeated, their marriage validated before the entire family council. But as they stood together in that quiet hallway, both of them understood that the true victory was not simply the legal validation they had received, but the deeper trust and understanding that had grown between them through the fight itself, forged in honesty rather than obligation, chosen freely rather than merely inherited from a dead man's regret. The journey back to Wolf Manor felt entirely different from the tense ride that had carried them to the council chamber days earlier. Alira sat across from Cassion in the carriage, watching the countryside roll past, and found herself stealing glances at him more often than she cared to admit, noticing small details she had somehow overlooked before. The way his expression softened when he thought no one was watching, the quiet strength in his hands, the faint scar along his jaw that he had never explained and she had never thought to ask about. "You are staring," Cassion said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth, though his eyes remained fixed on the passing scenery. "I am thinking," Alira corrected, though she felt her cheeks warm regardless. "About what?" "About how much has changed since I first stood in my father's hallway, certain you had come to steal our land," she admitted. "I was so convinced of your worst intentions, Cassion. I built an entire version of you in my mind before I ever gave you the chance to prove me wrong." "You had every reason to be suspicious," Cassion said gently. "I gave you very little reason to trust me in those early days. Secrets, locked doors, an obligation dressed up as a marriage proposal. I do not blame you for the assumptions you made." "Perhaps not," Alira said. "But I wonder now how different things might have been if you had simply told me the truth from the very beginning, rather than allowing me to build walls against you before I understood what I was actually defending myself from." Cassion considered this for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "I have wondered the same thing many times. I told myself I was protecting you, giving you time to adjust before delivering such a difficult truth. But perhaps, if I am honest, I was also protecting myself, afraid of how you might look at me once you understood the full weight of what our marriage was built upon." "And how do you feel about that now?" Alira asked quietly. "Now," Cassion said, finally turning to meet her eyes directly, "I find that the truth, however difficult, has brought us closer than any careful silence ever could have. I do not regret telling you, Alira, even though it cost us both a great deal of pain along the way." They arrived back at Wolf Manor as evening settled over the estate, the household staff greeting them with obvious relief at the news of Julian's defeat. Mrs. Whitfield, usually so composed, actually embraced Alira briefly before catching herself and stepping back with an embarrassed clearing of her throat. Clara wept openly with relief, admitting she had feared for her own position had Julian's scheme succeeded, given her role in exposing his letter. That evening, dinner felt different from every meal that had come before it, lighter somehow, filled with easy conversation and genuine laughter rather than careful, guarded politeness. Cashin told stories of his childhood at the manor, of a father who, despite his private sorrow, had taught him to ride and hunt and manage the estate with genuine patience and care. Elira shared memories of her own childhood, of her mother teaching her to tend the garden, of quiet evenings spent reading by the fire with both her parents, unaware then of the hidden sorrow her mother had carried within her. "Do you think she was truly happy?" Elira asked quietly, once the servants had cleared the final course and left them alone with the candlelight. "My mother, I mean, despite everything with your father." Cashin considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe people can carry sorrow and happiness together, Elira. One does not necessarily erase the other. From everything you have told me of her, your mother built a genuine, loving life with your father. That does not mean the memory of my father never touched her heart again. But I do not think that diminishes the life she chose. If anything, perhaps it makes her choice even more remarkable, building something real and lasting despite an earlier heartbreak that never fully faded." Elira found comfort in his words, a way of understanding her mother's private grief that did not feel like a betrayal of the happy childhood she remembered. "Thank you," she said softly, "for helping me see it that way." "I only spoke what I believed to be true," Cashin said. "Though I confess, I find myself thinking of our own situation in similar terms lately." "Meaning?" "Meaning that perhaps a beginning built on obligation does not have to determine everything that follows," he said, his voice carrying a quiet vulnerability she had not heard from him before. "I did not choose you initially out of love, Elira. I have never denied that. But I find, more and more each day, that whatever grows between us now is entirely separate from how it began. I find myself caring for you, not because my father asked it of me, but because you are clever and brave and far more forgiving than I likely deserve." Elira's breath caught in her throat at the unexpected sincerity in his words. "Cashin." "You do not need to answer," he said quickly, perhaps sensing her uncertainty. "I only wanted you to know the truth of what I feel, whatever you choose to do with it." The following weeks brought a gentle, steady deepening of the connection between them. Elira found herself seeking out Cashin's company more often, not out of obligation or careful strategy, but because she genuinely enjoyed his presence, his dry humor, his thoughtful observations about the tenants and the land, the way he listened carefully whenever she spoke, as though her thoughts genuinely mattered to him. They walked together through the gardens in the cool mornings, Cashin teaching her the names of the various roses his mother had once cultivated before her passing, Elira sharing stories of her own mother's gardening techniques, learned through years of working the harder, less forgiving soil of Ashworth Hall. They rode together across the estate in the afternoons, Cashin showing her the boundaries of land that would, someday, belong to their children, should they be fortunate enough to have any. In the evenings, they read together in the library, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes engaged in lively debate about the books scattered across the shelves, Cashin delighting in Elira's sharp wit and refusal to simply agree with his opinions out of deference to his title. It was during one such evening, several weeks after their return from the council meeting, that Elira found herself standing once again before the portrait of her mother in the eastern wing, now fully restored to its rightful place on the wall rather than hidden away in a locked, forbidden room. "She looks like you," Cashin said softly, coming to stand beside her, "around the eyes especially. I noticed it the very first day you arrived, though I did not yet understand why." "I used to think I looked more like my father," Elira said, studying the painted face that had once belonged to a young woman with a broken heart she had carried quietly for the rest of her life. "But perhaps I carry more of her than I realized, in more ways than simply appearance." "What do you mean?" "She built a life of genuine happiness despite an earlier disappointment," Elira said slowly, as though working through the thought even as she spoke it aloud. "She chose to love fully, rather than remain guarded forever against the possibility of being hurt again. I think perhaps I am learning to do the same." Cashin turned to face her fully, his expression carefully hopeful, as though afraid to hope too much too quickly. And what does that mean exactly for us? Alira met his gaze steadily, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with obligation or fear, and everything to do with the genuine affection that had grown quietly between them over the past difficult months. "It means," she said softly, "that I am no longer certain our marriage began the way I originally believed it did. Perhaps it began as an obligation for you. But I think, somewhere along the way, without either of us fully realizing it, it became something else entirely." "Alira," Cashin said, his voice low and unsteady with emotion, "are you saying what I hope you are saying?" "I am saying," Alira replied, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across her face, "that I find myself caring for you, Cashin Wolf, not because of any promise your father made or any debt owed to my family, but simply because of who you have shown yourself to be, patiently, honestly, over these past difficult months." Cashin reached for her hand, holding it gently, his thumb tracing careful circles across her knuckles. "I have hoped for this, Alira, more than I allowed myself to admit, even to myself." They stood together beneath the portrait of a woman whose own lost love had, through unexpected and complicated circumstances, ultimately brought their two families back together. And for the first time since the entire complicated arrangement had begun, Alira felt not the weight of obligation or inherited guilt, but the quiet, genuine hope of a future chosen freely, built on honesty rather than duty, on affection rather than debt. Yet even as their bond continued to strengthen, one final challenge remained on the horizon, an unresolved matter concerning Julian Wolf, whose humiliation before the family council had left him not defeated, but dangerously desperate, quietly plotting one final, more drastic attempt to reclaim what he still believed should rightfully belong to him. The letter arrived on a stormy evening, carried by a rider who had pushed his horse hard through the rain to reach Wolf Manor before dark. Mrs. Whitfield brought it to Cashin's study with obvious worry etched across her face, and Alira, sitting nearby with a book forgotten in her lap, felt an immediate sense of dread at the housekeeper's expression. "It is from the estate steward at Ashworth Hall," Cashin said, breaking the seal quickly and scanning the contents. His face went pale as he read. "What is it?" Alira asked, rising from her chair. "Cashin, what does it say?" "There has been an incident," Cashin said grimly. "A fire at the eastern barn. The steward believes it was deliberately set. And Alira, he says a man matching Julian's description was seen in the area the night before it happened." Alira's blood ran cold. "My father, is he safe?" "The letter says he is unharmed, but shaken," Cashin said, already moving toward the door, calling for his horse to be ready despite the storm raging outside. "I am leaving immediately." "I am coming with you," Alira said firmly, already reaching for her cloak. "Alira, the weather." "Is my father," she interrupted. "I am not remaining here while you ride into whatever danger Julian has created. We go together, Cashin, or I go alone." Recognizing the same stubborn resolve that had first caught his attention months ago, Cashin did not waste further time arguing. Within the hour, they were riding hard through the rain toward Ashworth Hall, Alira's heart pounding with fear for her father's safety and fury at Julian's apparent refusal to accept his defeat gracefully. They arrived at Ashworth Hall well past midnight, soaked through and exhausted, to find Edmund alive and unharmed, sitting shaken but steady in his study, surrounded by concerned tenants who had helped extinguish the fire before it could spread beyond the eastern barn. "Father," Alira cried, rushing to embrace him the moment she entered the room, "are you truly unharmed?" "I am fine, my dear," Edmund assured her, though his voice carried the residual tremor of genuine fear. "Frightened, certainly, but unharmed. The barn is a loss, I am afraid, along with a portion of this season's stored grain, but nothing that cannot eventually be rebuilt." "The steward mentioned Julian was seen nearby," Cashin said, his expression dark with barely controlled anger. "Did anyone witness him actually setting the fire?" "Not directly," Edmund admitted. "But one of the stable hands recognized him lurking near the property earlier that evening, and given everything that transpired at the family council, it seems an unlikely coincidence. Cashin's jaw tightened. This ends now. Whatever legal consequences the council recommended, I will personally ensure they are pursued to their fullest extent. Attempted arson, potential threat to human life, this goes far beyond a simple family dispute over inheritance. The following days brought a flurry of activity as Cashin coordinated with local authorities and the family council's legal advisors to formally investigate the incident. Evidence quickly mounted against Julian, witnesses coming forward with additional accounts of suspicious behavior, financial records revealing significant debts of his own that suggested a desperate motive beyond simple resentment over the title. When authorities finally located Julian at a small inn several miles from Ashworth Hall, he offered little resistance, his earlier confidence entirely replaced by the exhausted resignation of a man who had gambled everything on a scheme that had utterly failed. Facing formal charges and the complete collapse of his standing within the family, Julian was ultimately stripped of any remaining claim to Wolf family assets or title consideration, his branch of the family formally and permanently removed from any future succession discussions. He would face the legal consequences of his actions separately, a matter that would take months to fully resolve through the courts, but his ability to threaten Cashin and Alira's marriage, or the security of the Ashworth family, had been entirely and permanently eliminated. With the immediate danger resolved, Cashin oversaw the rebuilding of the damaged barn personally, ensuring the finest materials and most skilled craftsmen were employed, refusing to allow Edmund to bear any portion of the cost himself. Alira watched her father's home slowly return to its former state, grateful beyond words for the security Cashin's involvement provided, security that no longer felt like an obligation repaid, but like genuine care freely given. "You did not have to handle everything so completely," Alira said one afternoon, watching workers finish the final touches on the rebuilt barn. "The debt was already forgiven. You owed my father nothing further." "I did not do this because I owed your father anything," Cashin said, standing beside her, his hand finding hers naturally, comfortably, the way it had begun to over the past weeks. "I did it because he is your father, Alira, because his safety and happiness matter to me now, independent of any promise or obligation. That is simply the truth of where we stand now, whether either of us fully anticipated it when this all began." Alira smiled, leaning slightly into his shoulder as they watched the workers complete their final tasks. "I think my mother would be pleased to see our two families finally united in genuine care, rather than separated by fear and misplaced duty, as she and your father once were." "I believe you are right," Cashin said softly. They remained at Ashworth Hall for several more days, ensuring Edmund was fully settled and secure before finally making the journey back to Wolf Manor. The estate welcomed them home with the quiet warmth that had slowly become familiar to Alira over the past months, no longer the cold, unfamiliar place she had first arrived at with such deep suspicion and fear. That evening, standing once again beneath the portrait of her mother in the eastern wing, now surrounded by fresh flowers Alira had personally arranged, Cashin turned to her with an expression of quiet, unmistakable certainty. "I know how our marriage began," he said softly, taking both her hands in his. "I know the shadow of obligation and inherited guilt that hung over us in those first difficult weeks. But I want you to know, clearly and completely, Alira, that everything I feel for you now has nothing to do with any promise my father made, or any debt he asked me to repay. I love you entirely for who you are, brave, clever, fierce in your loyalty to those you care for. Whatever brought us together initially, what I feel for you now is entirely my own choice, freely made." Tears gathered in Alira's eyes, though they were tears of genuine happiness rather than the grief and confusion that had marked so much of her early time at Wolf Manor. "I love you too, Cashin," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Not because of any promise or any obligation, but because you have shown me, patiently and honestly, exactly the kind of man you truly are. My mother lost the chance to build a life with the man she first loved. I am grateful, more than I can express, that circumstances eventually brought us together instead, allowing us the chance she never had. Cashin smiled, warm and genuine, and gently pressed a kiss to her forehead, then to her hand, a quiet promise of devotion that needed no further words. Outside the window, the evening sun cast golden light across the estate that would, in time, become the foundation for the family they would build together, no longer burdened by inherited regret or hidden secrets, but grounded firmly in honesty, respect, and a love chosen freely by two people who had once been strangers bound only by an old debt and a dying man's unfinished promise. In the months that followed, Ashworth Hall and Wolf Manor became more closely connected than either family could have imagined at the beginning of this journey. Edmund visiting often, delighting in watching his daughter build a genuinely happy life. The shadow of Gerald and Aline's lost love finally, after so many years, transformed into something whole and complete through the unexpected union of their children. What had begun as fear, suspicion, and obligation had slowly, patiently, become something neither Alira nor Cashin had dared to hope for when this complicated story first began. A love built not on inherited promises, but on the genuine choice of two people who had learned, through honesty and courage, to trust each other completely. A year passed, and with it came changes neither Alira nor Cashin could have predicted on that first tense afternoon, when a debt notice had brought a stranger to her father's door. Wolf Manor no longer felt like the cold, unfamiliar place Alira had once wandered with suspicion in her heart. Every corridor now held a memory, every room a small piece of the life she and Cashin had built together, patiently, honestly, from the wreckage of a beginning neither of them had chosen freely. It was early spring when Alira discovered she was carrying their first child, and she remembered the moment she told Cashin with a clarity she suspected would remain with her for the rest of her life. He had been reviewing estate accounts in his study, and when she spoke the news quietly from the doorway, he rose so quickly he nearly overturned his chair, crossing the room in 3 swift strides to gather her into his arms with a joy so unguarded it brought tears to her eyes. "A child," he whispered against her hair. "Alira, a child." "Our child," she corrected softly, and felt him smile against her. The pregnancy brought its own quiet transformations to the household. Mrs. Whitfield, who had grown fond of Alira over the past year despite her initial reserve, took to fussing over her with a tenderness that reminded Alira, unexpectedly, of the way her own mother once cared for her during childhood illnesses. Clara, now firmly established as Alira's closest friend and confidant within the manor, spent hours with her sorting through old nursery furniture stored away in the attic, laughing over the faded, old-fashioned designs while planning what the new nursery might look like. Edmund visited more frequently as the months progressed, delighting in the prospect of grandchildren, and Alira noticed, with quiet gratitude, how comfortable her father had become within the walls of Wolf Manor. No longer the anxious, defeated man who had once feared losing everything to a stranger's debt notice, but a man who had found genuine peace in his daughter's happiness and security. Cashin, too, seemed changed by the prospect of fatherhood, spending long hours in the eastern wing where his own father's portrait now hung beside Aline's, studying the painted faces of two people whose lost love had, through unexpected circumstance, ultimately given rise to the family Cashin and Alira were now building together. "I used to resent him," Cashin admitted one evening, standing before his father's portrait with Alira's hand resting gently in his. "For his weakness, for choosing duty over love, for the years of quiet sorrow that colored my entire childhood. I do not feel that resentment any longer." "What changed?" Alira asked softly. "I understand him now in a way I could not before," Cashin said. "He made a mistake, a costly one born of fear rather than malice. But in his final years, he found the courage to try to correct it, even in the smallest way, by asking me to protect your family when the day came that you needed it. I do not think he ever imagined it would lead to this, to genuine love between our children, to a family neither of us knew we were building until it was already well underway. But I believe, wherever he is now, he would be glad to see it." Alira leaned her head against his shoulder, studying the two portraits together, two people who had lost their chance at happiness but whose children had, against every expectation, found their way to something whole. "I believe he would be glad," she agreed. "And I believe my mother would be glad as well." Their daughter was born on a bright autumn morning, healthy and loud, with a full head of dark hair that Mrs. Whitfield immediately declared came from her father, though Alira privately thought the shape of her eyes carried an unmistakable echo of her own mother's portrait in the eastern wing. They named her Elinor, after the grandmother she would never meet, but whose quiet, hidden love story had ultimately given rise to her own existence, a fitting tribute to a woman who had carried her private sorrow with grace, and who had, in her own way, taught her daughter the courage to choose genuine love over safe, guarded distance. News of Julian's formal conviction arrived that same autumn, the courts finally concluding their lengthy investigation into the arson at Ashworth Hall, and the fraudulent testimony he had attempted to manufacture before the family council. He would serve a lengthy sentence, his ambitions for the Wolfe title and estate entirely and permanently extinguished, a distant, unpleasant memory that no longer held any real power over the happiness Alira and Cassian had built together. Life at Wolfe Manor settled into a rhythm of genuine contentment over the following seasons. Alira took on greater responsibility in managing the estate's finances and tenant relations, her natural intelligence and fierce sense of fairness earning the respect of tenants who had once regarded the new Duchess with cautious uncertainty. Cassian, in turn, grew more relaxed and open with each passing month, the quiet burden of his father's regret finally lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the genuine joy of the family he had built through honesty rather than obligation. They hosted a small gathering that winter, the first true celebration Wolfe Manor had seen in many years, inviting tenants, distant family members who had supported them during the difficult council proceedings, and of course Edmund, who beamed with pride throughout the evening, watching his daughter move confidently through her role as mistress of the grand estate that had once seemed so intimidating and foreign to her. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had departed and little Elinor had been settled to sleep in her nursery, Alira found herself standing once again in the eastern wing, Cassian beside her, both of them looking up at the portraits of Gerald and Elinor that had once represented a secret so carefully hidden, and now represented instead the beautiful, unlikely beginning of everything they had built together. "Do you ever wonder," Alira asked quietly, "what our lives might have looked like if that first debt notice had never arrived, if we had never met at all?" Cassian considered the question seriously before answering, his arm settling comfortably around her shoulders. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "But I do not spend long dwelling on it, because I find I cannot imagine my life any other way now. Whatever brought us together, Alira, however complicated or unconventional the beginning, I would not trade what we have built for any simpler, more predictable path." "Neither would I," Alira said softly, resting her head against his shoulder as they stood together beneath the portraits of two people who had lost their own chance at happiness, but whose children had found their way, through courage and honesty, to something lasting and true. Outside, snow began to fall gently across the grounds of Wolfe Manor, dusting the gardens where roses would bloom again come spring, the same gardens where Alira had once stood watching Julian's carriage arrive with such dread, now transformed into a place of quiet peace and genuine belonging. The locked door that had once held so many secrets stood open now, permanently, its darkness replaced entirely by warmth and light, much like the fear and suspicion that had once defined the earliest days of Alira and Cassian's unconventional marriage, now replaced by a deep, unshakable love that neither obligation nor scandal nor inherited regret had ever managed to destroy. In the years that followed, Alira often told their daughter the story of how her parents had come to love each other, not the polished, simplified version that might have made for an easier tale, but the full truth, complete with debt notices and locked doors, family betrayals and courtroom battles, fear and doubt, and the slow, patient work of building genuine trust from an uncertain beginning. She wanted Elinor to understand that love did not always arrive simply, or easily, or exactly as one might expect, but that it could still, given honesty and courage and enough patience, grow into something entirely real and lasting, regardless of how complicated or unconventional its roots might have been. And so the story of Ashworth Hall and Wolf Manor, of a debt that became a marriage, and a marriage that became genuine love, passed down through the generations that followed. A reminder that even the most difficult beginnings could, with enough honesty and courage, eventually lead to something truly worth cherishing.